think the final CVR Vista seminar of the season, although we have another seminar next week, which is a neuroscience seminar by Roger Inoka. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name. But this is the last of the CVR Vista seminars for the season, and a great way to end off the fall term, to have with us Odelia Schwartz from University of Miami. So Odelia was up a couple of years ago for the Fields Symposium that Chris and Joel and others organized. And those of you who were able to see her talk there know what a fascinating program of research she's leading at Miami. Odelia, just to give you, the cat is sitting on your biography. Just a brief bio of Odelia before we start off. So, I mean, I know Odelia through her work on connecting the statistics of natural scenes to computational neuroscience models of visual processing. So she's well known in the computational neuroscience community. She did her PhD at NYU and did postdoctoral work at the Salk, and has been a professor at Miami for a number of years, associate professor in computer science there. And her research is funded from a broad array of sources, including NSF, NIH, an Army Research Office Award, Google Faculty Research Award, and a Sloan Research Fellowship Award. So we really wanted to have Odelia come back up physically for our seminar, but that wasn't possible. So, but delighted to have you here, at least in virtual form, Odelia. And I'll just hand the floor over to you.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. I was also hoping to come physically, but I'm happy to see you all in Zoom. So this is kind of my natural environment in Miami at the university. And this seems to be one of your natural environments. Is that right? So when I looked it up on Google, that's one of the images that popped up. So my interest has been understanding how the brain makes sense of visual images. And one of the areas of focus that I've spent a lot of time on is spatial context. So if you look at one part of an image, you never see it in isolation. It's always your view of the image is always influenced by, for example, what surrounds it in space, or maybe what you've observed in the past. And so spatial context has been a major focus of my work. And by the way, even though this is Zoom, I really like interruptions, as though it's like a real talk. So if anything doesn't make sense, or you have questions, just ask me. So one of the things that drew me to thinking about context affects our illusions. In this example, the two greens, although they look different, they're the same color. And in this example of the tilt illusion, which I've done some work, is where the surround grading affects the way you perceive the center. And even though illusions might seem like an anomaly, they're actually kind of a window into how we see the world. Another aspect that drew my interest was an understanding for natural scenes. So how do you make sense of how neurons respond to surround information? And we know that, for example, in primary visual cortex, neurons are selective to a certain part of the image, about 1 degree, and they'll respond strongly, let's say, to this preferred orientation. But if you put up a large grading in the surround, you often have contextual influences like suppression. And what we were interested in is what happens when you put up an image. How does that influence the neural response? And more recently, I've been interested in understanding hierarchically what's going on. So how do you go from a model of V1 to understanding what happens even just in V2 in the next area? So in terms of theoretical frameworks, a lot of the work that I've done for V1 that I'll give you a summary of is can be thought of as stimulus oriented, or in machine learning, unsupervised learning. So based on this idea that the brain is sensitive to the statistical structure of stimuli in the environment. And another approach, which has especially come up these days with deep neural networks, but of course also before, appeals to the computational or behavioral goal of the circuit or animal. And within the stimulus-oriented ideas, there's at least two complementary ideas. One goes back to the idea of Helmholtz, that perception can be viewed as inference of properties of the world. So I can infer a center stimulus given the surrounding information. A complementary idea goes to the idea of efficient coding. So Atnev and Barlow hypothesized in the 1950s that sensory processing is matched to the statistics of stimuli and aims, for example, to reduce redundancies. So this is the approach that that I've used, especially for the early cortex work. And so the motivation for this talk is going to be that on one hand, spatial context effects are prevalent. We see them in neurons and in perception. They're important for grouping, segmentation, and everyday behavior. And they've been implicated in disorders. A lot of the V1 work has been kind of motivated by this idea of, at least when I was looking at it at the time, we don't really understand that much about these kind of complex contextual influences for images. And some of the more recent work has concentrated on this idea of how do we push further and understand what's going on in deep neural networks. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to first give you an outline of the V1 work, of how we've looked at contextual irregularities and matched that to V1 data. And then I'll tell you what we've been doing with the hierarchical models. So in terms of V1, we started out with Adam Cohn's data. Well, we didn't really start there. That was the start of the looking at images, where we looked at a small and a large image. And what you find is that for the large image, you get contextual influences. And if you look at a single neuron and a bunch of images, you see that sometimes you get surround suppression and sometimes you don't. So we wanted to build a model to understand when you should get surround suppression and when not. And this is the same figure, but you could see that sometimes you're not getting very much suppression and sometimes you are getting surround suppression, depending on the image that you put up. So one could start out with a vanilla model of normalization to try and explain these influences. And divisive normalization is a well-known kind of canonical computation that's been used a lot to explain cortical data. So the idea is when a lot of neurons are active, then the response is dampened, you divide. And this has been used, of course, in vision and in many other systems. And we first tried this vanilla model on the data, and it didn't explain the data well, because what happens is that when there was surround suppression, the model did a pretty good job at predicting it, but sometimes when there wasn't much surround suppression, the model would still predict suppression. So one could try to fit a bunch of different standard models. So, the standard model could depend on the properties of the filters and whether it's tuned or untuned. So we actually tried a bunch of standard models, and we couldn't get a good fit just by kind of brute forcing, trying the standard models. And so what we asked is whether following this kind of image statistics path could explain this type of data. So the idea of the image statistics is that you have an image, and we could look at two filters in two different spatial locations and sweep it across the image. And what we see is that when we look at the responses to these two filters, they're not statistically independent. So for example, when you have a strong response along the tie, the kind of shirt area here of Einstein, you're going to get a strong response also with the other filters. so it's not independent. And we can look at this more empirically in terms of the statistics. So the way to look at it is whenever the response through one filter is very low, we can ask what is the distribution of responses through the other filter. This is a conditional distribution. And we find that it's also low. And whenever the response is high, we can ask what's the distribution, and we find a wider distribution. So this type of dependency, these are cross sections through this two-dimensional conditional histogram. And if they were statistically independent, these would be the same, these two cross sections, but they're not. So this kind of highlights a particular type of dependency that's not linear. And the type of approach we followed with the image statistics is from a redundancy reduction point of view, we want to go from this dependence to something more independent. A complementary approach, which we've followed more recently, and that's also the content of this talk, is a generative model where you first try to build the dependencies. And then as is standard in machine learning, you can invert the dependencies and get out essentially that independent component. And the reason we go there to the generative model is because it gives us a richer characterization of the statistics. So that allowed us to get a richer model. And so we generate these dependencies through multiplication. So it turns out that to undo it or to invert the model, we're essentially dividing. And so we're back to divisive normalization. But the generative perspective gives us a richer model. So this is how we generate the dependencies. We use what's known as a Gaussian scale mixture. The idea is that you have two Gaussian variables that are themselves independent. So if I were programming this statistical model, I would make two Gaussian variables and they would be independent. And then I would multiply them together either by small values or by large values. So values coming from this other mixer distribution. And that introduces the statistical dependency that we see. So the idea is you have local variables with a shared mixer variable, and you get this type of dependency. For those of you who know this type of idea, the Gaussians themselves could actually be correlated. So you could actually have like an extra degree of also linear correlation. And the distribution also goes from a Gaussian to a highly quadratic distribution. And once you have, so I'm actually not sure, are people pretty familiar with some of this introduction or not in terms of how fast to go?
Yeah, so Odelia, V is, what's V's distribution? V is also a random variable, correct?
Yeah, so V is a random variable. And so,
it's
yeah, it's a random variable and it's positive. And so it's multiplying the Gaussians either by small numbers together or large numbers together. And then what you end up getting, if you actually, like, if you open like Python or MATLAB and took two Gaussians and then a third variable like a Rayleigh distribution and did this type of point-by-point multiplication, that's what you'd get, this type of a bow tie dependency. So I mean, the details don't really matter so much except to know that one can generate these dependencies statistically and that the way you do it is multiplicative. And so then the idea is once you've generated the dependencies, you want to be able to go back and infer the local variables. So that's the idea of inverting the model. And I see some chat, so let me see. Yeah, that's a good question. So, and I see that Joel gave the answer that I would have given to the question already. The contrast is the kind of typical example of high and low contrast, kind of giving insights into what this V can mean. And here, because we end up using these kind of cortical filters, we also end up having dependencies that relate to orientation, structure, and center and surround. But certainly contrast is like the classical example of where you would want to, how you would, that would be relevant for generating these dependencies. And so now you can go back and invert the model and infer the local Gaussian, which is the more independent component. And this relates to efficient coding because we've inferred the Gaussians, which are more independent, or they're entirely independent. They might have a linear correlation. And it relates to divisive normalization because we've inverted a multiplicative way of generating the dependencies. And so what we have is a way of generating the dependencies, a way of undoing what we just generated. And this gives us the potential for richer models. So on one hand, we have a way of relating to divisive normalization, which we said is a canonical computation. On the other hand, we can now put the chocolate topping and the strawberries on top, try to get a richer model of the dependencies. And so that's what we did next. So really this type of dependency I've told you about happens if you're inside, for example, you're not always going to see the dependency, although on average you will. So if you're inside a zebra, for example, you're looking at a patch of zebra, then the center and surround will see similar statistics and you will have this strong dependency. And if you're on the borders, and this is a little bit of an extreme cartoon, but it's still the case, if the center and surround are seeing very different parts of the scene, then at the extreme, you're going to have things that are independent. So a better model of thinking about how dependencies between center and surround is saying that sometimes center and surround are dependent and sometimes they're independent, and maybe in between. So on the extreme, you have the homogeneous model with the mixer variable that is shared between two local variables. And at the other extreme, you have an independent generation of each of the center and surround. So now this inference of the local variable amounts to the probability, the posterior probability that center and surround are dependent times that inference of the expected value plus the probability that they're independent. So basically, the Gaussian estimate is a linear combination of this scenario of dependence and of independence. And so what we did in practice is we took an ensemble of images and we learn the parameters of this model for the images. And we have, in this case, orientations at different center and surround locations, 2 phases. And the model parameters, one of them is the prior probability that center and surround are dependent. And that relates to the prior probability for belonging to each of these 2 models. And there's actually another parameter we learn. I told you that these Gaussians can actually be correlated linearly. And so we learn a linear covariance matrix as well. And that turns out important because it gives an indication of what is linearly correlated with what. And that also drives when things will be deemed dependent or independent in the end. So we actually learned both these features, both these parameters. And then the optimization is standard. So we maximize the likelihood for an ensemble of images. We use expectation maximization to do that. And once you learn that, then for any given patch, you could ask what is the probability that center and surround, the posterior probability that center and surround are dependent. And here we learned it on a set of images. This is like a standard. This is before when everybody was using ImageNet in this example. But we've done this now also with ImageNet and other. So once you optimize the scene ensemble to a model, it always makes sense to actually see that what you assumed in the model is what actually comes out from your learning. And so here we verified that after learning, you're going from a highly quartotic filter response to something that is much closer to Gaussian. And in addition, the filters go from something independent to something much more dependent to something much more independent. So that's basically showing that our model, it's more like a proof of concept even for ourselves. The model is doing what we expect it to do. And this is a view of the linear correlations that are learned. So what you see is that similar orientations, the red is the strength of the covariance between two of these. This gives you the geometry of the arrangement. And so basically, when you have the same orientation in the center and surround, and when it's collinear, you have the strongest, you learn the strongest linear dependency. So it has a geometric preference for collinearity, which makes sense because images have kind of extended edges in them. And so one can, this just shows you one orientation, but you could also see that when you look at the vertical in the center, it's going to be much less correlated with, for example, horizontal in the surround. So this gives you kind of a view of the linear correlations that are learned. Oh, okay. So this is an old slide that I updated, so it doesn't make sense.
I have a question
Yeah.
on the previous slide.
Yeah.
Were you able, did you test for co-circularity? Were you able to get that from this unsupervised learning?
We don't obviously get co-circularity in this way. I think it's, what?
Well, so the upper right position, the question would be, given conditioned on a vertical stimulus in the center, what is the peak orientation in the upper right? Is it vertical or is it tilted?
Yeah, so I would say maybe a better answer is we have not looked at this. And the reason is because we don't have, to find this, we'd need a more fine-grained surround orientations.
Yeah, you're
so
just using 4 or.
Yeah, here we're using 4. And so that the strongest we have is between the center and the surround of the same orientation, and not the one that's diagonal. And I also suspect, I'm not sure if I mean, we'd need to test this, but we had tried to look at kind of these salience displays where you have a bunch of different orientations. And it could be that to get some of these kind of circularity effects, you would need a more fine-grained orientation. So I would say I'm not sure about the answer.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you are rectifying the polarity or not? So these are odd symmetric filters, or?
The filters, so when we look at the filters are themselves not rectified at the beginning, but in the full model. So we're learning it on the filters before rectification, basically, the statistics. But once you have a neural model, then you end up rectifying the response. So it's the response, the denominator is positive, the numerator can be negative or positive, and then you will end up like taking rectification or complex cell. So you're going to end up having something rectified. But for the statistical model, like these bow ties are showing you that it's before rectification. So you could have like negative and positive values.
So you're right, but so for the filters, you said you're using 2 phases, is that correct? or
Yeah, there's two phases, exactly.
odd and even, or
odd and even, yes.
yeah.
So we have the two phases, and we do see, of course, dependencies between the two phases. But in the end, we end up essentially making a complex cell from the response to the negative and to the even and the odd phase. But in essence, the statistics, you learn them on the non-rectified response, and then you do add rectification.
Okay.
And I see another question in the chat about texture-based dependencies, and that's a very interesting question. That's something we are looking at, that I'll show you when we get to the second area, or to the hierarchical model. So at the level of V1, like filters, we don't really get texture dependencies. We get now, I guess I should remind you that we're learning for a given filter, we're learning what is the most likely, what are the dependencies with the surround. We're not learning, which we did in different work, where we can learn a bunch of different patterns of dependencies. So it's a little bit of a, one can learn this to different degrees of richness in terms of what you're doing with the center and surround. Here we're basically learning for 4 different orientations in the surround, and for a given neuron oriented in the center, what is its statistical dependency. But I'll show you textures later on. But does that answer your question about rectification?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So what we did was, once we learn this model, we can put up example stimuli and ask when the model will deem high dependence or low probability of dependence. And so this is just an example to show you, kind of related to the covariance matrix, can almost be thought of as a type of a template that gives you something about when things are likely to be more dependent. And here you could see that for this collinear arrangement, you're going to get high probability of dependence. For same orientation, high probability, and for different orientation, low probability of dependence, and lower probability of dependence for the parallel pattern. Contrast also plays a role. So contrast is also important in terms of determining when center and surround are deemed statistically dependent. So in terms of this model, we started out looking at a bunch of kind of simple stimuli experiments. So experiments where you have different gratings in the center and the surround, and you vary things like orientation, you vary contrast and spatial position, and you compare the model. Then we went to the tilt illusion, where you take a population of neurons and look at that. And what I'm talking to you here about is the predictions for natural images. So I just want to summarize the idea of this model. So when center and surround are deemed statistically dependent, the surround is on and you have normalization. When center and surround are deemed more independent, the surround is off. This does relate to ideas of salience and kind of breakdown of homogeneity that have been in the literature. And in terms of comparing to Adam Cohn's data, what we ended up having is not, if we compare the standard normalization model to flexible normalization, we essentially have this extra knob of the probability that center and surround are statistically dependent for a given patch, the posterior probability. And this comes from the image analysis and not from fitting the data. So kind of the way we do this is that for every neuron, it has its different selectivity in terms of the receptive field properties, what spatial frequency it prefers, what orientation it prefers. And so we essentially are learning this model for every neuron that we're recording from Adam, and then looking at the results. So this is a kind of proof of concept where we took all the patches that a neuron deemed as homogeneous, statistically dependent, center and surround, and heterogeneous. This is a cartoon of the patches. And we asked, when the model deems things homogeneous, do we indeed with the data get more suppression? And we find that we do. So when we look, these are different neurons, and we see that we get more suppression. It's above this diagonal line. So we get more suppression for homogeneous than heterogeneous. And again, this is learned for every neuron. And so you could imagine that for one patch, depending on what exactly the neuron is seeing, its receptive field structure, it'll see a different part of the scene. And so that is why you have to learn it for every single neuron. And when we fit the data to the model, what we find now is it's still not, of course, perfect, but we're getting a much better fit. So when the flexible predicts that suppression is on, it behaves like the standard model. But for some of the images, the flexible is predicting that you don't get suppression. And then in this case, on average, we're getting a better match to the data. So the type of model we now have is a divisive normalization model where surround inference can be turned on or off, or to a certain degree. With this data, it actually turned out that if we binarized whenever the probability of dependence was higher than 0.5, we made it 1, and whenever it was lower, we made it 0. That worked just about as well as using a graded probability of dependence for the images we used, although we later ran more experiments to kind of reveal cases that are more in between. In terms of mechanism, there's been other suggestions in the literature that can connect to this model. One has to do with adjusting circuits, and this is Ken Miller and others. And the other has to do with thinking about distinct classes of inhibitory interneurons. So the idea that you might have a gating interneuron that's gating the surround suppression. And I think at this point, so this is the part about V1 modeling. So maybe at this point, it makes sense to take questions before I continue to the hierarchical model.
Is there a distinction between parvo and magno in this kind of circuit? And yeah.
There's not, yeah. So we do not make that distinction, and that's something that I guess one could add. What would be your expectations? Or
yeah, I wasn't really sure. I mean, I thought, I'm not really an expert in this area, but I thought receptive field sizes might be different. That might make the surround suppression asymmetric.
I see. What is dependent and what is independent? Yeah, that, I mean, that could be an interesting thing to look into. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, just this, when you put up this picture, I was thinking, okay, this gating mechanism could be like a boundary detector, right? Could be like a bunch, parvo cells that are really finely finding a boundary and sort of switching things off and on. So that's the other thing.
I see. Interesting. Yeah. I saw Joel raised his hand.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused. If you went back just a couple of slides to when you showed the scatter plot, yeah, with the modulation ratio, the MRs.
This one?
Yeah, they're higher for the heterogeneous environments. Is that right?
Yeah. So the when it's homogeneous, the modulation The modulation is amount of suppression. So like a dot here would be 0.4 here, but like 0.2 something here. So here you're getting more modulation.
I see, less suppression and hence more.
Well, more suppression for the homogeneous, basically. So the modulation index is in the direction that that the smaller number is more modulated, basically.
Ah, thank you. That's the part that I missed.
Yeah. Any other questions?
There is one question in the chat from Irfa.
Let's see if I can.
About even versus odd.
Yeah, I saw it. I think it goes back to like one of the earlier slides. You did talk about even and odd, and I'm just guessing if that is just if it's internal to, you know, it's internal or on the boundary. Is that what you mean by even and odd?
Oh, I think I had it here.
It's on the zebra, I think.
Oh, did I have an even and odd on the zebra? Because one time I meant just quadrature pairs when I said even and odd.
I think it was me that said even and odd, actually. So even would be a line detector and odd would be an edge detector.
Yeah, so I mean we're learning quadrature pairs.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there more questions on this part? So let me go on to the next part and tell you about some of the more recent work we've been doing with this direction. So what we're trying to do is to incorporate this type of computation into deeper networks. And we're specifically have been looking at deep convolutional neural networks. And as you know, deep convolutional networks are only very loosely designed to capture brain hierarchy. And they've been, in recent years, successful in explaining some cortical data. And the reason I kind of moved towards looking at deep convolutional networks, so I'm not only doing that, I'm also looking at unsupervised networks where I continue the unsupervised learning. Basically, I have a V1 model and now I learn the next stage. So you could imagine having this normalization in the first stage. Now you do some linear transform, you get the second stage. And we've done some of that work. And what convinced me to also go in the deep learning route is one, that there has been success in explaining cortical data, but also just the richness of filters that you find, let's say, in the second layer. So although we are currently looking at kind of what filters can you get out of a bunch of models and how rich it is and what is it and how would it compare to visual cortex, for me, just looking at the second layer and kind of visualizing the filters, what Zaylor and Fergus and others have done was interesting and led me to think that this might be an interesting way to continue this work. So, so what we've done is two pieces of work. One, which we've already done, is learning an unsupervised model. So basically we treat the deep neural network as a bank of filters now in the second layer. We take those filters and we try to predict when things are dependent or independent. So try to understand something about the statistics of, let's say, the second layer of AlexNet. The other thing that we've started to do, and I'll show you just preliminary data at the end, is kind of the advantage of what I just told you is that we can learn the full statistical model because we're taking this unsupervised learning and just now applying it to another layer. The disadvantage is what you'd really want if you're thinking of a cortical model is you want to have this normalization in the first layer and the second layer. You want to learn in both layers simultaneously. So we've thought of a bunch of ways of doing that, but what I'll show you is some recent work where we're learning an end-to-end learning. So we're learning normalization in a few layers simultaneously. But then we've been using a simpler heuristic currently of kind of the full statistical model. So really what we want is to take what I think a lot of people these days have been doing is asking, can we take more computations that are more like the brain or circuits that are more like the brain and put them into deep neural networks and understand what that means. And so normalization is actually something that's been used a lot in deep neural networks. Here's a whole range of papers starting from local contrast normalization to local response normalization, which is in AlexNet, to a bunch of recent layer and instance and group, a bunch of different normalizations. And it's used for various purposes. Sometimes it's for regularization, or people have shown that it can improve classification. And this is just a picture of some of them. So layer normal, if you treat, this is the channel. So if it were primary visual cortex, this would be the different orientations. And the width and the height is the spatial neighborhood. And so this is just showing you some of these normalizations, like a group and layer and local response normalization. And AlexNet is just in one location across all the channels, a bit like conceptually like cross orientation suppression, where you have suppression in the same location and so on. And the normalizations that you have in these deep neural networks are often, they're not always more restricted than what you see in cortical modeling. And even though they're maybe different in some of the cases, I think they face the same questions. How do you actually choose what to divide by? You know, all of these are choices that people are making for their purposes. So what we wanted to do was take our flexible normalization and think about surround, on or off within kind of this framework. So here we have the different channels. So we still have all the center channels, and now we have a surround that could be on or off. And so this is just another depiction of the same thing. We're taking, if AlexNet is taking 5 center filters and having this local response normalization, we're adding to it this idea of having surround that can be switched on or off. And I just put this in, but I think like you've all seen the AlexNet convolutional neural network, and we're looking at the different layers, conv1 up to conv5. So we're looking at the 5 different layers and asking, or really more at the first ones. I'm going to be more focusing on the first 3. And what we want to do is examine the statistics and ask whether you find statistical dependencies and what happens when you have normalization. So these are taking a filter in the center location and the surround location in the AlexNet second layer and looking at the statistics. And what you find is that you get these bow tie statistics. We're looking here at the same feature in the center and the surround. And when we learn this flexible normalization on the second layer of AlexNet, we obtain more independence, showing that the model is applicable to the second layer of AlexNet as well. And this is showing the histograms that it's becoming more Gaussian, as you would expect. Joel?
Do you leave the max pooling steps in AlexNet, or are they removed in place of this flexible normalization?
We do leave them. No, actually, well, we leave them up to where we're looking. So we in this case, we pre-train AlexNet, and we take the second convolutional network. That means it's gone through some max pooling before, And now we're taking the second convolutional output, and that's our input to the model. So then we take those filters and we're learning it now in the unsupervised learning model. And if we're in this third layer, then whatever happened up to there, we take. In the later, what we've been doing now end to end, we also leave it, but we add our own normalization layer within the mix. So we have, like, in addition to the local response normalization, or instead, we put in our normalization.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're going to address this. Can you say anything about how the weights change with and without normalization?
So here, you mean the weights in AlexNet?
So you're retraining.
Yeah.
AlexNet with the normalization. So I'm wondering if it's possible to compare statistically or something the types of receptive fields you get compared to what you get in the original AlexNet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the work I'm showing you now is not, we don't retrain because we basically pre-train. So we take the AlexNet filters and then we learn unsupervised on them. But the new work I'll talk about towards the end, which I have a student who's been working on, we are retraining. So there, that's actually a great question. We have not looked at that yet. So we basically got a model now that is able to retrain on AlexNet. And we're looking at the statistics and the classification, and looking at the filters would be of great interest. You know, do we get something similar or different in that way? I don't expect them to be very different, but I think it would be interesting to ask and to see the differences. But right now, in what I'm showing you now, we started with the simplest approach of saying, let's just take a layer that's pre-trained and analyze that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we can see that we do find these dependencies for the AlexNet filters, and it becomes more independent after the normalization. We quantified this in a number of ways. So we looked at the mutual information. Here we're just ordering the neurons of the deep neural network from smallest to largest mutual information. And what you see is that the flexible normalization reduces the mutual information. We also tried a control model that's not so bad in doing that, which always normalizes, but learns a covariance matrix, so it is weighted. And we also looked at the entropy. So here you could see that the entropy becomes Gaussian for the flexible normalization, and this one is the control model, the green line. And the other interesting thing we found when we analyzed the first 3 layers of AlexNet is that the mutual information and also the entropy are so for the first layer, you're getting the sparsest distribution and the highest mutual information. For the second layer, on average, it's reduced. For the third layer, on average, it's reduced. And then essentially it gets more and more reduced. So it's as though the deep network itself is doing some of this reducing dependencies and Gaussianization, although there's probably other dependencies that we just are missing later on because you're also going from Reddit Toppy to something that you might have other things that are statistically dependent in higher layers. But at least for this center surround, it seems like the early layers are the most kind of relevant. This is another summary of this idea where this is the first layer of AlexNet, and you see on average this very nice bow tie and very sparse distribution. this is on average the second layer, and here's the third layer on average. It doesn't mean that in the third layer you don't find dependencies, but it's just on average much less. And this shows the type of structures. So someone asked about textures. When you look at filters in the second layer of AlexNet, some of them are texture-like. And for those, what we basically learn, the covariance does not have a geometric preference. It's everywhere. And these are examples of full patches where center and surround are the most dependent. So you see that it's basically most dependent when the center and surround textures are similar. In other cases, we might have boundaries with the horizontal line and the verticals. And in that case, it is geometric dependent. So you're getting more dependency for things along these axes. And these are example images that have most of this dependency. And those are the two, this is a bunch of examples. The two things we've seen the most are these textures and these directions that are more geometrically, that have a geometrical preference. Again, we haven't explored the full center surround combinations. So here, there might be, if you took a more graded possibilities of centers and surrounds and how dependent they are, you might find other structures, and maybe that's also the case in higher areas. But for this model, what we're finding are the texture dependencies and then the geometric directions of space. So any questions about this? Yeah, so this kind of gives a picture of what might be statistically dependent at this level. And it could also suggest directions of experiments of understanding kind of center surround in the next visual area. The idea of detail.
I have one small question. So these receptive fields that you're showing, these are just from backpropagating activations?
Yeah, it's kind of from inverting the model. So it's Zahler and Fergus have a paper on that, where you're essentially going back in the model, and so this is an example of what the filter will look like, and these are the patches that are most so yeah, this is essentially, we replicated Zahler and Fergus for these receptive fields. And the idea of detexturization has been noted for a paper by White, Bear, and Pasupathy. They talk about V4, and there's some kind of this idea of detexturization. So you do get suppression for homogeneous textures. But I think there's the more interesting, or the additional question is kind of richer structure, and how similar are these cases where we kind of would predict that center and surround are dependent to what would happen in something like V2. This just gives you another kind of way of looking at the second, what's happening in this layer. And if this is an original image, this gives us the inferred posterior distributions, where the part that's darker is more center surround dependent. So you see that it's basically blocking out the background more. If you put up a full texture, then you're going to get a lot of it becomes dark because you're getting center surround dependencies. Whereas in layer 1, you're not really getting that much for this. So that's kind of the unsupervised learning and what we've looked at AlexNet. And we've already kind of gone into this in the earlier part, but what we're now doing is, because we've been training with the unsupervised just one layer at a time, what I'd really like is a more complete model of what something like V2 might be. And even before thinking of V2 surround effects, there's the question of V2 receptive fields and how good a match are they to V2 data. So like just the center responses, how good are they a match to V2 data? And for that, you'd want to learn, the normalization in the first layer and then go to the second layer. And if you want surround effects, you'd want normalization in 2 layers. So what we've been doing now is training these end-to-end models. And we've been using, we've started with 2 approaches, and the one that runs fast and that we've been doing so far more of is a heuristic approach. So this is a supplementary material that Rubin had in his 2015 paper, where he looked at the full Bayesian inference of the posterior probability that center and surround are dependent, and compared that to a simpler heuristic. And so we found that one can have a heuristic that depends on the energy in the center and surround filters and replace the full inference with this heuristic. And so what we've been doing is taking this heuristic and basically inserting it into this end-to-end deep neural network learning. So that prevents us from having to learn something too complicated. The other approach we've been taking is the idea that you might actually want to learn this gating maybe by its own kind of neural network, taking the center and the surround inputs and learn when to divide and when not. But what we currently have running is the heuristic. And this is, again, just a reminder of kind of some of these models of normalization. And what Chupin has been doing is, as a first step, just running classification. And this is CVR. He's now doing this with ImageNet. And what we find is that so we're comparing, in this case, we put batch normalization in, and then we compare a bunch of these other normalizations. So batch normalization is just often used as a more global divide by the past in terms of standard deviation as a regularization. We've tried with and without it, but I'm just showing you a result here with. So we have batch normalization, and on top of that, a local normalization. And what we find is that for shallow networks of 1 and 2 layers, maybe up to 3, our approach is competitive. So you see we're doing better in the first layer than some of the other normalizations. As you go to more layers, then sometimes the other approaches are doing better. And so it seems like our approach is potentially, and that kind of goes also with the statistics we've been looking at, is potentially useful for early areas or early layers in achieving better performance. So if you have a deep network with a lot of bells and whistles, it's probably less useful. But if you have a more shallow network, then it might be more useful. So this is just really preliminary CVR data of classification. And what we want to do is take this to, comparing with neural data. And analyze a bunch of things that we still want to analyze with this. So this is really work in progress.
So Odelia, would you predict that if you use your flexible normalization on layers 1 to 3, let's say, and then add on the other like group or whatever at the end, it's not going to do better?
Yeah, it's not clear. Like, yeah, I think with ResNet, so he ran like ResNet, and one of them might have been better. Maybe the group or the instance was sometimes here. I guess it's not very good. But yeah, I think so. I think having a global more like a batch plus one of these locals helps, but I think that's been known. It's not, so having not just one of them, but both seems to boost performance. But also once you get to high layers, you see it goes away. So the batch is not much worse than, I guess the best here is the DN model, which is kind of crafted after the Rich Zemmel's normalizing the normalizers approach related to, yeah.
I have a question. So the batch is just in training, isn't it? There's no inference stage.
Yeah, the batch is just, that's just like the standard thing that people would do with neural networks, which is like take a batch and subtract the mean and divide by the standard deviation, basically.
But all the other types of normalization are there during training and inference.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think that what we've been learning with these models is that I think one thing with deep neural networks is that the more you start to put in a lot of bells and whistles, you could do really good in classification. And so I think our network seems to perform well when it's in cases where you have not a lot of layers, and you're, you could also start different ways of learning and how you change the learning rate. All those things can affect performance. So it does get pretty tricky. But I think if anything, what we're seeing is that the first and second layer we seem to have some advantage. And the other issue is that our model is, well, this image data set is not very rich to begin. I mean, CVR is not as rich as something like ImageNet. And the heuristic is pretty simple. So we're still, working on other variants and understanding performance in ImageNet, et cetera. I don't expect like huge, in terms of classification, my expectation is we might, continue to get a little bit of advantage in low layers. But my hope is that it's useful once you start to think about maybe generalization, maybe things like, Matthias Bethke has a lot of examples where neural networks don't generalize well. Do we have some advantages there? Contrast is an easy generalization, so I think it's not that hard to get a network to train on one contrast and learn another. But one might have advantages for normalization, for a kind of a good normalization. And then the other question is for neural data and comparing to data. The first, we know that in V1, there's an advantage to modeling contextual influences. And so there's a question of what can we glean from these approaches?
I want to ask one question if I can. It's not clear if the image recognition, the ImageNet task or the CVR task is the right task where we would see the biggest effects of normalization, right? So we know these networks are kind of using bags of features approaches, and the flexibility of your normalization is might have its biggest impact on things like accurate shape and segmentation and so forth, right? So.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that definitely testing on other tasks would be, we might see more of a benefit. Because as you're saying, segment, if what we're trying to do is when things belong together and when they're segmented, then our normalization can be useful in such cases. But I think again that it's more for Well, I think we still need to compare, if you took something like a very deep network and compared it, it can do segmentation pretty good. So, so one would need to find these, I think the comparison of where we might expect our network to especially do better is when you don't have a very deep network, which in sometimes, maybe for the brain, it makes sense to have these nonlinearities already in the first and second area, rather than having lots and lots of areas. Yeah. Joel?
I'm just wondering, it looks like, for the deeper nets, batch norm plus divisive norm is like just a little bit better than your approach. And I'm wondering whether that difference is just because it's like easier to train something with divisive normalization, or whether you think that the divisive normalization actually has sort of more image computation power in the deep networks. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. And my guess is that it might be the training aspect, because we're using a heuristic in our training. And so it could be that that just learning the weights of the divisive normalization is easier to do in this case. I'm not sure when we get to a more complete model. I mean, actually, the other thing I should point out is that the more you go to higher layers, our model tends to not incorporate the surround as much. So it's actually kind of, it seems like it's leaning more towards just choosing the center surround off. And another difference we have from the DN model is that we have we looked at the same orientation in the surround as the preference of the neuron, whereas the DN model had many different orientations. So it could be that if we just add that to our model, we might get a little bit of advantage from that. So we're using a somewhat, if let me just go back to this picture. The divisive normalization is using kind of all the surrounds, whereas we're using just the same orientation as the center for our surround group. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we still need to explore this, but I kind of agree that different tasks, generalization, and for us, of course, cortical data are important directions. And so this is the first step of looking at classification, I think, is more of a proof of concept. Is it working? Are we getting something that is competitive for shallower networks? And indeed, the statistics, how well are we capturing the statistics, which we're still exploring with this heuristic? How well are we really capturing it? It's not working as well as the full model. So that actually ends my second part of the talk. So I think I could take more questions at this point. We started out thinking about primary visual cortex and building a model of spatial context based on surround suppression on or off. And now we've made progress along a number of ways of incorporating it into these deep networks. And I think, for us, there's still lots of open questions where both understanding the implications of having this surround on off, and also understanding the relationship to the biology, such as area V2. And I want to just point out, I've mentioned these people throughout. Louis was a postdoc in my lab, and he's now faculty. And Chupan is a graduate student that's been working on the end-to-end normalization. Nasir I didn't really talk about his work, I think, in the end here, but what Nasir had done was when we first looked at AlexNet, we wanted to know whether the second layer makes any sense in comparison to V2. And so, or the third, or, do layers of AlexNet correspond in any way to V2? So we looked at some of the texture data of Freeman et al. And Ruben and Adam are collaborators. Ruben was a postdoc with me. He's a faculty at Albert Einstein, and both Ruben and Adam were collaborators on all the V1.
Great. That's an amazing talk. Thank you so much, Odelia. Really interesting.
Thank you.